The North Pole was a place like no other, a world steeped in endless snow, shimmering with the magic of the aurora borealis, and alive with the hum of tiny, industrious hands crafting toys for children across the globe. At the heart of this enchanting realm stood the grand workshop of Santa Claus, a figure so revered that his very name conjured visions of warmth, generosity, and unconditional joy. Yet, behind the rosy-cheeked smile and the twinkle in his eye, Santa Claus harbored a hidden trait. He was infamously competitive. The jolly old man adored challenges of all kinds. Whether it was organizing his team of elves for their annual sleigh-packing race or settling playful debates over who made the best hot cocoa in the workshop kitchen, Santa thrived on proving himself. But like all men, even the legendary bringer of Christmas cheer had a flaw, and his was a streak of arrogance that reared its head when he least expected it. One frosty evening, with the snow piling high against the windows of the workshop and the warm glow of the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls, Santa gathered with his team of closest elves. They had finished their day's work, polishing sled runners, testing new toy prototypes and sorting wish lists, and now lounged in the cozy hearthroom, sipping spice cider and nibbling on sugar-dusted pastries. The conversation had drifted from workshop logistics to a more playful topic: Santa's knack for winning hearts. "Let's face it, boss," said Peppermint, a sharp-witted elf known for her fiery red hair and a tongue to match. "You've got a silver tongue and a sack full of charm. You could probably talk your way into a locked chimney if you wanted to." Santa, lounging in his oversized armchair and stroking his snow-white beard, let out a deep, rolling laugh. "Talk my way into a chimney? Oh, Peppermint, I don't need to talk my way into anything. It's the magic of Christmas that does the work." The elves chuckled, but Peppermint wasn't one to let the conversation rest. "All right, Magic Man," she said, leaning forward with a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Are you saying there's no one in the world you couldn't win over?" Santa's eyes twinkled as he leaned back, his voice thick with mock seriousness. "I'm saying," he began, pausing for dramatic effect, "that there isn't a heart on this earth, or beyond it, that I couldn't win. Love is the very essence of Christmas, and I, dear friends, am its ambassador." The elves erupted into murmurs and whispers. Jingles, the oldest elf in the room, adjusted his tiny spectacles and raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold claim, Santa. A dangerous one." "Too dangerous? Nonsense." Santa replied with a dismissive wave. "What's the point of spreading joy if you don't believe in the power of love?" Peppermint, never one to shy away from pushing boundaries, exchanged a look with the others before speaking again. "If you're so sure of yourself, we've got a challenge for you. A real one this time." Santa's eyebrows rose as he took another sip of his cider. "Oh, and what would that be?" Peppermint smirked. "You know Margareth, don't you? She runs the little bakery on the edge of the village. Sweet woman, the best baker in the North Pole. But, well, let's just say she hasn't exactly been swimming in suitors." The room grew quiet. Everyone knew Margareth, a kind, soft-spoken woman with a heart as warm as her oven and a talent for baking that made her the unofficial supplier of all things delicious in the North Pole. But Margareth, with her ample frame and shy demeanor, had long been the target of whispers and unkind judgments from those who failed to see her beauty. Santa set his mug down, suddenly interested. "What about Margareth?" Peppermint's smirk widened. "Win her heart. Better yet, marry her. If you can pull that off, then we'll believe you're the greatest heart winner of all time." The other elves gasped, their laughter bubbling up as the audacity of the challenge sank in. Santa hesitated for only a moment before his pride took the reins. He chuckled, his deep voice resonating in the room. "That's the challenge. To win the heart of a woman as sweet and kind as Margareth. Why, that's no challenge at all." "Then prove it," Peppermint countered, crossing her arms. The elves erupted into cheers, egging him on. Even those who normally stayed out of such antics couldn't help but join the fun. Santa stood, his stature commanding, and raised his mug high. "By Christmas Day," he declared, "Margareth will be Mrs. Claus." and I'll show you all what the magic of Christmas and a little charm can do." As the laughter subsided and the cider flowed, Jingles sat quietly in his corner, his wise old eyes narrowing. He knew Santa's heart well, and this boastful bet felt like trouble. "The heart is not a prize to be won," he muttered under his breath, unheard amidst the revelry. Far away, in the warmth of her bakery, Margaret had no idea that she had just become the centerpiece of a bet that would change not only her life, but the very heart of Christmas itself. The day after his boastful declaration, Santa Claus began executing his plan with the determination of a man who had never backed down from a challenge. He didn't see it as cruelty. In his mind, it was harmless fun, a game that would affirm his charismatic reputation among the elves. What he didn't consider, even for a moment, was how this would affect Margaret, a woman whose heart, though strong, had endured years of quiet hurt. Margaretha's bakery sat at the edge of the North Pole village, its stone walls wrapped in ivy that glistened with frost. A sign hung above the door, carved with the words "Sweet Wishes Confectionery." Inside, the air was warm and fragrant with cinnamon, nutmeg, and chocolate. Margaret worked tirelessly each day, her capable hands kneading dough, cutting shapes, and decorating treats with meticulous care. Her smile was soft and genuine, though her eyes often betrayed a flicker of loneliness. It was during the morning rush that the little brass bell above her door jingled, signaling a new customer. When Margaret looked up from her counter, her breath caught. Santa Claus, in his iconic red coat trimmed with white fur, filled the doorway with his imposing presence. His cheeks were rosy from the cold, and his beard sparkled faintly with frost. It wasn't unusual for Santa to visit the bakery, but this time, something was different. His smile was warm, warmer than usual, and his eyes seemed to linger on her with unusual attentiveness. "Good morning, Margaret." Santa's voice boomed, full of cheer. "What a fine day to visit the best baker in all the North Pole." Margaret flushed slightly, her hands instinctively smoothing her apron. "Good morning, Santa. You're too kind. What can I get for you today?" "Gingerbread man, snowball truffles." Santa approached the counter, his eyes scanning the rows of perfectly displayed pastries. "I'll take whatever you recommend," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "After all, who knows better than you?" Margaret chuckled, her cheeks rosy. "Well, if you insist, I'd recommend the peppermint bark. It's fresh out of the oven, and the elves can't seem to get enough of it." Santa nodded enthusiastically. "Peppermint bark is, but only if you promise to have one with me." Her laughter bubbled up, light and airy. "With you? Oh, Santa, I'm not sure I could keep up with your sweet tooth." "Nonsense," he said, winking. "It's not just about the sweets. It's about sharing moments with good company." As the morning unfolded, Santa stayed longer than he ever had before. He sampled her treats, asked about her process, and praised her talents with an earnestness that made Margaretha's heart flutter. The regular customers couldn't help but notice, exchanging whispers and glances. By the time the bell above the door jingled again, signaling Santa's departure, Margaret felt something she hadn't in years, a spark of hope. But Santa's plan didn't stop there. Over the next week, he returned to the bakery almost daily. He complimented her craftsmanship, bringing laughter and warmth to her otherwise quiet days. On one visit, he brought a bouquet of holly and pine, wrapped in red ribbon. "For the most talented baker I know," he said, presenting it with a flourish. Margaret accepted it with wide eyes, her heart skipping a beat. "Santa, you didn't have to. This is lovely. Nothing compared to you, Margaret," he replied smoothly, watching her cheeks turn a deeper shade of pink. Soon, he began inviting her for strolls around the village. They visited the twinkling Christmas markets and the frozen lake, where elves skated in dizzying circles. His charm was relentless, and Margaret, though cautious, found herself drawn to him. One evening, as they walked beneath the glowing northern lights, Santa turned to her and said, "Margaret, spending time with you has been the highlight of my season. I can't help but feel there's something magical about you." Her breath caught at the sincerity in his tone. "Santa, I don't know what to say. No one's ever spoken to me like this. Then let me keep speaking to you, he said, taking her hand gently. Margaretha's friend Clara noticed the change immediately. One snowy afternoon, as they sipped tea in the bakery's kitchen, Clara leaned in. Margie, you've been glowing lately. What's going on? Margaret hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. It's Santa, she admitted softly. He's been wonderful, kind, thoughtful. I never imagined he'd see me this way. Clara's brow furrowed slightly. Santa, huh? Well, he does have a reputation for making miracles happen. But Margie, just promise me you'll be careful. Your heart's too precious to be toyed with. Margaret nodded, though her thoughts were filled with swirling uncertainty. Could it really be true? Could someone like Santa Claus, the most adored figure in the world, see her, truly see her, for who she was? As the snow fell heavier outside her bakery that evening, Margaret allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that perhaps Christmas miracles were real. She didn't know that across the village, in the elves' lounge, Santa laughed with Peppermint and the others, recounting every step of his so-called progress. Easy as pie, he said, swirling his cider. Or should I say, easy as gingerbread. The room erupted in laughter, but Jingles, as always, sat silently. His ancient eyes clouded with unease, he whispered, You're playing with fire, Santa. And fire burns. Santa, too wrapped up in his arrogance to notice, simply waved off. He had no intention of failing. After all, it was just a harmless bet, or so he thought. Margaret Wakefield was the beating heart of the North Pole village, though she would never have claimed such a title herself. Her life revolved around the bakery, a small but bustling haven of warmth and sweetness amid the perpetual frost. The scent of caramelized sugar and freshly baked bread spilled into the streets every morning, drawing villagers like moths to a flame. Despite the biting cold outside, Margaretha's bakery was a sanctuary of comfort and kindness. Her days started before dawn. While the village was still shrouded in darkness, Margaret would light the brick oven, its amber glow the only source of heat in the icy pre-dawn hours. She would hum softly to herself, her voice blending with the rhythmic kneading of dough and the gentle clatter of measuring cups. Her routine was meticulous. Sticky toffee putting cooling on the counter by sunrise, trays of gingerbread men lined up like a cheerful army, and glistening sugar cookies in every festive shape imaginable. For Margaret, baking was not just a livelihood, it was her way of communicating. Where words failed, her pastries spoke of love, care, and her deep desire to bring joy to others. But beneath the rosy cheeks and warm smiles lay a woman who bore the quiet weight of judgment. In a village filled with sprightly elves and slender, graceful figures, Margaretha's robust frame and unassuming demeanor often made her the subject of whispers. Though never cruel to her face, she could sense the subtle shifts in conversations, the fleeting glances exchanged when she entered a room. "Good morning, Margie," called Clara, her lifelong friend, as she entered the bakery one bright morning. Clara was as effervescent as the frothy whipped cream Margaret topped her hot cocoa with, and she made it her mission to lift Margaretha's spirits whenever she could. "Good morning, Clara," Margaret replied, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She reached for a plate of cinnamon rolls. "Care for one fresh out of the oven?" "You spoil me," Clara teased, taking the plate with a wink. She perched herself on a stool by the counter, watching her friend move about the bakery with practiced ease. "So," Clara began, her voice dropping conspiratorially, "are the villagers still lining up for your candy cane shortbreads?" Margaret chuckled. "If I had a peppermint for every time someone asked for the recipe, I could build a second bakery." Clara grinned, but then tilted her head, her expression softening. "Margie, you're a marvel, you know that? You're so good to everyone in this village. Always thinking of the children, the workers, the elderly. But who's good to you?" Margaret paused, the question catching her off guard. "Oh, Clara, don't be silly," she said lightly. "I'm happy when others are happy. That's all I need." But Clara wasn't convinced. She reached across the counter, covering Margaretha's hand with her own. You deserve more than that. You deserve to be seen, to be loved for who you are, not just for what you do for everyone else." Margaretha's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, her guard slipped. "I don't mind being overlooked, Clara," she said quietly. "I know what people think. I hear the whispers. But as long as I can brighten someone's day, even a little, then I'm content." Clara squeezed her hand. "You're stronger than you realize, Margie. But don't let anyone take advantage of that strength. Not even someone as charming as Santa Claus." At the mention of his name, Margaretha's cheeks flushed. Clara, please. He's just being kind. That's who he is." "Kind, sure," Clara said with a raised eyebrow. "But there's kindness, and then there's whatever this is. He's been at your bakery every day this week, hasn't he? Bringing you flowers, inviting you for walks under the northern lights. I've known Santa for years, Margie, and I've never seen him act this way with anyone else." Margaret busied herself rearranging the pastries on the counter. "He's just spreading Christmas cheer," she said, though even she didn't sound convinced. Clara studied her friend carefully. "Well, cheer or not, just promise me one thing. Guard your heart, okay? You deserve someone who sees you, not just the baker, but the incredible woman underneath." Margaret nodded, though her thoughts were swirling. Could it be true? Could someone like Santa Claus, the most beloved figure in the world, see her for who she truly was? She dared not dream too much, for fear of the heartbreak that so often followed. Still, as she closed a bakery that night, the memory of Santa's smile and the warmth of his words lingered. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a life where she wasn't merely a baker, but someone truly cherished. Unbeknownst to her, Santa was far from cherishing her. Back in his workshop, surrounded by a gaggle of mischievous elves, he recounted every detail of his interactions with Margaret. "It's like taking candy from a baby," Santa declared, his voice thick with confidence. "She's practically falling at my feet already." The elves erupted into laughter, raising their mugs of cider in a mock toast. Only Jingles sat apart, his arms crossed, and his eyes filled with disapproval. "You're playing a dangerous game, Santa," he said gravely. "A heart isn't a toy, and it's not yours to break." Santa waved him off, too absorbed in his own cleverness to heed the warning. "Relax, Jingles. It's all in good fun. Besides, what's the harm in a little Christmas miracles?" But Jingles could see what Santa could not. The threads of his plan were already tangling into something far more complicated than he had anticipated, and the cost of unraveling them would be higher than Santa could ever imagine. The North Pole's Christmas Eve celebration was the highlight of the year, a dazzling event that brought together elves, reindeer handlers, and villagers to celebrate the season in grand style. Under the glow of a towering spruce adorned with glittering ornaments and strings of golden lights, the community gathered in the central square. The air was crisp and filled with the melodies of carolers, the aroma of spiced cider, and the laughter of children playing in the snow. Margaret stood at the edge of the festivities, clutching a mug of cocoa to keep her hands warm. She had dressed carefully for the evening, wearing a flowing green dress embroidered with snowflakes and a red shawl draped around her shoulders. Clara had insisted she add a touch of sparkle with a delicate silver brooch shaped like a star. "You look radiant, Margie," Clara said, nudging her as they watched the dancers twirl beneath the tree. Margaret smiled shyly. "It's just the magic of Christmas," she replied. But Clara had noticed more than the Christmas magic. She'd seen Santa, standing not far from the crowd, watching Margaret with a gleam in his eye that seemed almost too deliberate. As the evening unfolded, he made his way toward her, his towering presence parting the crowd effortlessly. "Margaret," Santa greeted her warmly, his voice carrying above the chatter of the celebration. "You look absolutely stunning tonight." Margaretha's cheeks flushed as she lowered her gaze. "Thank you, Santa. You're too kind." "Kindness has nothing to do with it," he said, offering her his arm. "Would you care to join me for a stroll?" Clara gave her an encouraging nudge, and Margaret hesitated only a moment before accepting. The two walked through the square, the festive energy of the village swirling around them. Santa spoke of the joy of the season, the importance of togetherness, and the beauty of the northern lights that had just begun to shimmer in the sky above. Margaret found herself swept up in his charm once again, the world around her feeling like a dream. As the clock struck 9 and the celebration reached its peak, Santa suddenly called for attention. "My friends," he bellowed, his voice silencing the crowd. All eyes turned to him, and Margaretha's heart skipped a beat as she realized he was still holding her hand. "I have an announcement to make." The villagers gathered closer, their faces alight with curiosity. Even the elves, usually busy organizing the evening's festivities, paused their work to listen. "Christmas is a time for miracles," Santa began, his voice carrying with the authority of someone who had delivered countless gifts and countless speeches. "It's a time for love, for joy, and for believing in the impossible. And tonight, I want to share with you a miracle of my own." He turned to Margaret, his eyes gleaming under the soft glow of the lights. "Margaret," he said, his voice softening but still audible to the crowd, "you've brought a light into my life that I didn't know I was missing. You've reminded me of the true magic of Christmas, kindness, generosity, and the beauty of a loving heart." Margaret felt the world tilt as Santa knelt before her, pulling a small, ornate box from the pocket of his coat. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Margaret Wakefield," he said, his deep voice filled with theatrical sincerity, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you be Mrs. Claus?" The world seemed to stand still. Margaretha's hand flew to her mouth, her heart racing as she processed what was happening. Around her, the villagers began to cheer and clap, their excitement filling the air. Clara's eyes were wide with disbelief, but she offered an encouraging nod. Tears welled to Margaretha's eyes as she looked down at Santa, the man who had, over the past weeks, made her feel seen, valued, and cherished in ways she had never imagined. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. Then louder, with all the courage she could muster, she repeated, "Yes, I'll marry you." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause as Santa stood, slipping a sparkling ring onto her finger. He pulled her into a warm embrace, the lights of the Christmas tree casting them in a golden glow. Around them, elves whispered among themselves, exchanging knowing glances. As the village celebrated, Santa smiled broadly, basking in the applause and adoration of the crowd. But deep inside, he felt the weight of a secret he was carrying, the knowledge that this proposal was born not of love, but of a bet. For now, though, the cheers drowned out his doubts, and Margaretha's glowing face convinced him that the game was still his to win. Unbeknownst to him, the seeds of his arrogance had already sown cracks in the perfect image he was trying to maintain. The announcement of Santa and Margaretha's engagement spread like wildfire through the North Pole. The entire village was abuzz with excitement, for what could be more fitting than Santa Claus himself finding love during the season of joy? The elves worked tirelessly to prepare a wedding that would be as magical as Christmas itself, while Margaret, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of events, allowed herself to dream of a future she never thought possible. The ceremony was set for just days before Christmas Eve, a tight schedule, but one that the elves assured could be done with their boundless enthusiasm and organizational prowess. The entire village pitched in, stringing garlands of holly and mistletoe across the square, fashioning ice sculptures that glimmered in the winter sun, and baking enough confections to fill a sleigh. Margaretha's dress was a marvel, a deep red velvet gown trimmed with gold thread, perfectly tailored to her form. It shimmered under the light, a nod to the holiday spirit she embodied so well. Her veil, a cascade of sheer fabric embroidered with delicate snowflakes, was a gift from the seamstress elves, who had worked on it in secret. "She looks like a queen," Clara whispered to one of the elves as they peeked at Margaret in her small dressing room. "She'll be Mrs. Claus soon enough," the elf replied with a grin. As the day of the wedding arrived, the village square was transformed into a winter wonderland. The massive Christmas tree in the center stood as a beacon, its lights twinkling like stars against the frosty backdrop. Rows of seats made from intricately carved ice lined the aisle, and a dais at the front held a shimmering arch of icicles and evergreen branches. Santa, in his crimson suit adorned with golden embroidery, stood at the altar, his usual confidence slightly dimmed by an unshakable feeling. The cheers of the crowd swirled around him, but their warmth failed to reach the cold knot forming in his chest. He brushed it aside, reminding himself that this was all part of the challenge, a game he had no intention of losing. The music began, a chorus of bells and soft strings, and the crowd rose to their feet. Margareth appeared at the far end of the aisle, her arm linked with Clara's in place of family she had long since lost. The sight of her drew a collective gasp from the villagers. She radiated elegance, her face alight with a mix of nervousness and happiness. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on Santa's, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. She saw not the man who had charmed her over the past weeks, but the symbol of Christmas itself, a figure who had brought joy to so many. And now, she thought, he was choosing her. When she reached the altar, Santa took her hands in his, the crowd's murmurs settling into silence. The officiating elf, a wizened figure named Elder Holly, began the ceremony with a speech about the power of love, kindness, and unity. Do you, Nicholas Claus, promise to cherish and honor Margareth, to share in her joys and burdens, and to make her a part of your world from this day forward? Elder Holly asked, his voice carrying across the square. Santa smiled broadly, his voice firm. I do. And do you, Margareth Wakefield, promise to stand by Nicholas Claus, to share in his mission of spreading joy, and to bring your warmth and love to his life and work? Margaretha's voice trembled, but held steady. I do. As the crowd erupted in applause, Elder Holly declared them husband and wife. Santa leaned down to kiss Margareth, and for a fleeting moment, he was struck by the sincerity of her expression. It wasn't the laughter of a crowd or the ringing of bells that filled her eyes, but something deeper, something genuine. The reception was a whirlwind of laughter, music, and celebration. Margareth floated through the evening, accepting congratulations and compliments with a grace she hadn't realized she possessed. Santa, ever the showman, played his part flawlessly, dancing with Margareth under the starlit sky and toasting their union with dramatic flair. Yet, as the evening wore on, a nagging unease crept into Santa's mind. While Margaretha's smile shone with pure joy, his felt increasingly like a mask. Every kind word she spoke, every gentle glance she offered, chipped away at the illusion he had built around the bed. Finding someone who sees me for who I am, Margareth said during her toast, her voice soft but carrying through the crowd, is the greatest gift I could have ever received. Thank you, Nicholas, for believing in me. Her words drew cheers and applause, but Santa felt a weight settle on his chest. He clinked his glass against hers, the corners of his mouth pulling into a practiced smile. As the festivities continued late into the night, Margaretha's happiness was undeniable. She had stepped into a world she never thought she'd be a part of, surrounded by people who finally seemed to celebrate her for who she was. Santa, however, could not ignore the quiet voice in the back of his mind. It whispered doubts, asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. What had begun as a game now felt dangerously real, and the stakes were no longer about winning or losing. The newlyweds departed the reception in a flurry of snowflakes and cheers, the crowd wishing them well as they boarded Santa's sleigh. Margareth, wrapped in a cloak lined with white fur, looked radiant as she held his hand. "Where are we going?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Wherever you'd like," Santa replied, forcing the smile to remain on his face. As the sleigh ascended into the starry sky, the cheers of the crowd faded below, leaving only the sound of the wind and the gentle jingle of the reindeer's harnesses. Santa glanced at Margareth, her face glowing with contentment, and felt the weight of his choices pressing down harder than ever. For now, Margareth was blissfully unaware of the truth, but the fragile foundation of their union would not hold forever. And as the sleigh soared through the night, Santa couldn't shake the feeling that his perfect game was teetering on the edge of collapse. Life as Mrs. Claus began with a flurry of activity for Margareth. The elves, eager to welcome her into the fold, marveled at her creative energy and organizational skills. She revamped the toy factory's break area, replacing its Spartan benches with plush cushions and adding cheerful garlands strung with miniature candy canes. The once bare dining hall now boasted festive centerpieces, plates piled high with her signature desserts and the warmth of Margaretha's laughter. But as the weeks passed, the reality of her marriage to Santa Claus began to settle, layer by layer, like the snow that blanketed the North Pole. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Villagers greeted her warmly wherever she went, offering compliments about how she had brought new life to the community. Children waved at her from sleighs, and even the reindeer seemed to respond with gentle nudges when she approached their stables with a handful of treats. Yet in the quiet moments, when the hustle and bustle subsided, Margareth felt an ache she couldn't ignore. The ache was most pronounced at home, in the Grand Lodge she now shared with Santa Claus. Their house, a sprawling log cabin with high vaulted ceilings and roaring fireplaces, was a masterpiece of comfort and holiday charm. But for all its beauty, it felt cold. Santa, once a fixture in the shared spaces, now spent most of his time in his study or the workshop. Margareth often found herself alone, tidying up the sitting room or planning new menus for the elves' meals, her heart heavy with questions she couldn't bring herself to ask. One evening, determined to create a moment of connection, Margareth set about baking a batch of her finest gingerbread cookies. She sifted flour, whisked spices, and mixed the dough with precision, humming softly as she worked. The aroma of baking cookies soon filled the lodge, weaving its way into every corner. When the cookies were done, she arranged them neatly on a festive tray, decorating each with intricate patterns of white icing. She added 2 steaming mugs of cocoa, topped with whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon, then carried the tray into the study where Santa had retreated. "Nicholas," she said softly, standing at the threshold. Santa looked up from his desk, where piles of parchment and toy schematics were spread out. His expression, one of mild distraction, didn't change as he saw her. "I thought we could take a break," Margareth continued, offering a hopeful smile. "It's been such a long day, and I made your favorite, gingerbread cookies with extra cinnamon." Santa's gaze flickered to the tray, then back to her face. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "That's very thoughtful of you," he said, his tone polite but distant. "But I really need to finish this inventory tonight. The elves are behind schedule." "Oh," Margareth said, her voice faltering. She quickly recovered, forcing another smile. "Of course. Maybe tomorrow." "Maybe," Santa replied, already turning back to his work. Margareth lingered for a moment, hoping he might change his mind, but when it became clear he wouldn't, she turned and left the study. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. Back in the sitting room, she set the untouched tray down on the table. She sat for a long time, staring at the cookies, her thoughts racing. Had she done something wrong? Was he simply too busy? Or was there something more she didn't understand? Despite her growing doubts, Margareth remained steadfast in her efforts to make their marriage work. She continued her work at the factory, where the elves adored her, and threw herself into planning the upcoming Christmas feast. She convinced herself that Santa's distance was simply a result of the holiday rush, that once Christmas was over, things would return to normal. But as the days turned into weeks, the distance between them only grew. At night, Margareth would lie awake, staring at the canopy of their bed while Santa's even breathing filled the silence. She would glance at him, wondering what thoughts occupied his mind. Did he regret their marriage? Did he feel the same loneliness she did? During the day, she leaned on Clara for support. Her friend visited often, bringing news from the village and lending a listening ear. One afternoon, as they sipped peppermint tea by the fire, Clara finally voiced the question Margareth had been avoiding. "Margie, are you happy?" Margareth hesitated, her hands tightening around her mug. "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to be. I'm trying to be, but something feels off. Clara reached over, placing a comforting hand on her friend's arm. It's okay to admit when something isn't right, you know. You deserve to feel loved, Margie. Truly loved. I know he's busy, Margaret said quickly, as though defending him. He has so much on his plate, with Christmas coming and everything. I can't expect him to have time for everything I need. But you're his wife, Clara said firmly. You should be more than just another responsibility on his list. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but found she had no words. Unbeknownst to her, Santa was having his own struggles. The bet, which had once seemed like a light-hearted challenge, now weighed heavily on him. Margaretha's sincerity and kindness had caught him off guard. Every thoughtful gesture she made, every gentle smile she offered, chipped away at the wall he had built around the truth. He couldn't bring himself to confront her, or himself, about the lie their marriage was built on. One evening, as Margaret dozed in a chair by the fire, Santa stood silently in the doorway, watching her. The light from the flames danced across her face, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to really look at her. She was beautiful in her own way, not in the polished, magazine-perfect way the world celebrated, but in the warmth she exuded, the quiet strength she carried. A pang of guilt hit him, sharp and sudden. He turned away before she could wake, retreating to his study to bury himself in work. The elves began to notice the tension between the couple. Their whispers grew louder, fueled by the visible cracks in Santa's composure and Margaretha's increasingly forced smiles. Even Peppermint, who had initiated the bet, began to feel uneasy. This doesn't feel right, she admitted to Jingles one night as they worked side by side in the factory. It's not right, Jingles replied, his tone grave. And it's only going to get worse. As Christmas drew closer, the festive lights of the North Pole sparkled brighter than ever. But for Margaret and Santa, the magic was dimming, replaced by shadows neither of them fully understood yet. The night was unusually quiet in the North Pole, the usual hum of festive preparations softened by a thick blanket of freshly fallen snow. Inside the lodge, Margaret sat at her sewing table, stitching patches onto a quilt she was making for the elves' communal hall. The rhythmic motion of needle and thread had always been soothing, but tonight her thoughts were restless. Santa had once again retreated to his study after a brief dinner. Their conversations had become little more than exchanges of pleasantries, and Margaret was beginning to feel like a ghost in her own home. "Am I imagining things?" she whispered to herself, her needle pausing mid-stitch. She thought back to the tender words Santa had spoken during his proposal, the joy of their wedding, and the warmth she had felt in his presence. Where had all that gone? She set the quilt aside and stood, her bare feet silent against the wooden floors. She made her way to the window, gazing out at the snowy landscape. In the distance, the soft glow of the elves' workshop was visible, its chimneys puffing steady streams of smoke. The thought of the elves, always so cheerful and busy, brought a faint smile to her lips. At least they seemed happy. Her reverie was broken by the sound of muffled laughter drifting from the lodge's lounge. Curious, Margaret followed the sound, her heart beating a little faster. She peeked through the slightly ajar door and saw a group of elves gathered around the hearth, their faces alight with amusement. Among them, Santa sat in his usual armchair, a steaming mug of cider in hand. She didn't suspect a thing. Santa was saying, his voice rich with laughter. Margaret froze, her hand tightening on the doorframe. She held her breath, straining to hear. "Honestly, I thought it'd be more of a challenge," Santa continued, shaking his head. "But Margaret, she practically fell into my arms." The room erupted in laughter, Peppermint's cackle rising above the others. "Well, you've got that famous charm, Santa. Who could resist?" Another elf chimed in. "So, when are you going to tell her it was all part of a bet?" Santa waved a hand dismissively, though his smile faltered for a moment. "Tell her, never. Why ruin the funds?" The laughter continued, but Margaret heard no more. Her vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. and a lump formed in her throat. She turned and fled, her steps as quiet as they could be on the creaking wooden floors. She made it to their bedroom before collapsing onto the edge of the bed. The words she had overheard echoed in her mind, each one piercing her like a shard of ice. A bet. It wasn't real. The proposal, the marriage, the kind words, all of it had been part of a cruel game. For a long time, she sat in silence, her tears flowing freely. Then, slowly, her sorrow gave way to something sharper, anger. She stood, her hands trembling, and began to pack a bag. She didn't care where she would go, anywhere but here. As she folded her clothes, her movements became more purposeful, her resolve hardening with every passing moment. Margaret pulled a sheet of paper from the desk and grabbed a pen. Her hand shook as she began to write, but her words were steady. Nicholas, when you asked me to marry you, I believed in you. I believed in the man who spoke of love and magic, who made me feel like I mattered in a way I never had before. Tonight, I learned the truth. I am not a game to be won, nor a challenge to be conquered. I am a woman who deserves honesty, respect, and love. You've taken my trust and turned it into a joke among your friends. I can't stay here, not like this. Perhaps one day you'll understand what you've done. Until then, goodbye. Margaret, she left the note on his desk and slung her bag over her shoulder. As she stepped out into the cold night, the snow crunched under her boots. Her breath formed white clouds in the frosty air, and the northern lights shimmered above, mocking the turmoil in her heart. She walked toward the edge of the village, past the bakery she had once called her home. She would start over somewhere else, somewhere far away from the laughter that now haunted her memories. Inside the lodge, Santa sat alone by the dying fire. The elves had gone, their laughter fading into the night, and the warmth of the cider in his hand had long since cooled. He sighed, a strange unease settling over him. When he returned to the bedroom later, he found it empty. The sight of the carefully folded blankets on her side of the bed sent a chill through him. He spotted the note on his desk and read it, his heart sinking with every word. The paper trembled in his hand as he looked around the room, now devoid of her presence. The reality of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave, leaving him breathless. For the first time in a long while, Santa Claus felt truly, utterly alone. The wind howled fiercely across the open plains as Margaret trudged forward, the small bag slung over her shoulder, growing heavier with each step. She had no clear destination in mind, only the certainty that she could no longer stay at the North Pole, surrounded by memories of betrayal and false promises. The bitter cold bit at her cheeks, but she pressed on, her resolve keeping her warm in the freezing night. By dawn, she reached the small neighboring town of Winter Hollow, nestled at the foot of a mountain range. The village was quaint, with cobblestone streets, snow-dusted rooftops, and chimneys puffing wisps of smoke into the crisp morning air. It was a quiet place, and for now, that was exactly what Margaret needed. She rented a modest room above a general store, using the last of her savings. The space was simple but cozy, with a small bed, a wooden table, and a single window overlooking the square. After unpacking her few belongings, she sat at the table, staring out at the bustling market below. What now? She thought. For years, she had poured her heart and soul into the bakery at the North Pole, creating confections that brought joy to countless people. But here, she was just another face in the crowd, her skills unknown to anyone. As the days passed, Margaret wandered the village, taking in its quiet charm. The people of Winter Hollow were kind but reserved, their lives tightly knit into the fabric of the community. Margaret felt like an outsider, but she didn't mind. She wasn't ready to open her heart again, not yet. One afternoon, as she walked past an old, dilapidated storefront, she paused. The windows were covered in dust, and the wooden sign hanging above the door was faded and worn. It read, Hearth and Crumb Bakery. Margaret peeked through the dusty glass and saw the remnants of what had once been a thriving bakery, rows of empty shelves, a long counter with a broken cash register, and a massive brick oven in the back. Her heart ached at the sight. She could almost hear the hum of activity, the laughter of customers, and the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air. The idea took root before she could stop it. She approached the landlord the next day, an elderly man named Mr. Aldrich, who owned most of the buildings in the square. "You're interested in the old bakery?" he asked, raising a bushy, white eyebrow. "Yes," Margareth said firmly. "I'd like to rent the space." Mr. Aldrich chuckled. "It's been sitting empty for years. Needs a lot of work. Are you sure you're up for it?" "I'm sure," she replied, her voice steady. Margareth used the last of her resources to secure the lease and set to work transforming the neglected bakery into something new. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, polished the counters, and repaired the creaking shelves. The townsfolk watched with curiosity as she hauled bags of flour, sacks of sugar, and boxes of spices through the front door. She spent long nights testing recipes, her hands dusted with flour and her apron smudged with chocolate. At first, the results were far from perfect. The oven was temperamental, and she had to adjust to using unfamiliar equipment. But gradually, her confidence returned, and the familiar rhythm of kneading dough, piping frosting, and creating edible art brought a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The day of her grand opening arrived on a chilly morning. Margareth hung a new sign above the door, Margaretha's Hearth. It was a simple name, but it reflected the warmth she hoped to bring to the community. At first, only a few customers ventured in, drawn by the inviting aroma of cinnamon and vanilla that wafted from the door. A young boy bought a chocolate chip cookie, his eyes lighting up after the first bite. A tire merchant ordered a loaf of bread, praising its soft texture and perfect crust. Word spread quickly, and soon, the small bakery buzzed with life. Margareth poured herself into her work, her creations earning a reputation for their exceptional quality and the care that went into each one. She made it her mission to provide for the less fortunate, donating leftovers to the village orphanage and offering warm drinks to passers-by on cold nights. "Margareth, you've brought this place back to life," Mr. Aldrich said one evening, stopping by to purchase a batch of her famous sugar-dusted scones. She smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "I just wanted to create something that feels like home," and she had. Despite the pain she carried, Margareth had found a new purpose in Winter Hollow. She didn't think about the North Pole or Santa most days, choosing instead to focus on the joy her work brought to those around her. But late at night, when the bakery was quiet and the world was still, her thoughts sometimes drifted back to the man who had shattered her trust. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he ever regretted what he had done. The wound he had left was still raw, but Margareth was determined not to let it define her. She would not be a victim of his cruelty. She would be stronger, kinder, and more resilient than ever before. Christmas Eve dawned cold and bright in Winter Hollow, the village bustling with preparations for the festivities. Children darted through the streets clutching wooden sleds. Merchants bartered cheerfully in the square, and the sound of carolers filled the crisp air. In her small bakery, Margareth worked tirelessly to keep up with the demand for her holiday treats. Her shop was a haven of warmth and sweetness, its windows fogged with steam from the ovens. Platters of peppermint bark, sugar-dusted fruitcakes, and spiced molasses cookies lined the counters, drawing a steady stream of customers. Margareth greeted each one with a smile, her heart light despite the ache she still carried deep inside. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in a golden glow, Margareth closed the bakery for the night. She stood in the doorway, her breath clouding in the frosty air, watching the townsfolk gather in the square for the tree lighting ceremony. It was a scene of joy and community, a reminder of why she had chosen to start over in Winter Hollow. But her peace was short-lived. From the shadows of the square, a familiar figure emerged. Santa Claus, in his red coat and fur-trimmed hat, stood just beyond the reach of the twinkling lights. His face was uncharacteristically solemn, the usual sparkle in his eyes replaced by something heavier, regret. Margareth froze. her pulse quickening. For a moment, she considered retreating into the bakery and locking the door, but the weight of his gaze held her in place. She squared her shoulders and stepped down from the stoop, closing the distance between them. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. "I came to see you," Santa said, his tone low and sincere. Margareth crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "After everything, you think you can just show up and expect me to listen? You don't belong here, Nicholas." Her use of his name stung more than he had anticipated. He took a tentative step closer, his breath visible in the icy air. "You're right. I don't deserve your time, your attention, or your forgiveness. But I couldn't let another Christmas go by without trying to make things right." Margaretha's jaw tightened. "Make things right? How exactly do you plan to do that? Undo the bet, erase the lies." Santa flinched at her words, each one landing like a blow. "I can't undo what I've done," he admitted. "I can't take back the hurt I caused or the trust one broke. But I can tell you the truth. I already know the truth," Margareth snapped. "I overheard everything, remember? You didn't love me. I was a challenge. A game. Nothing more." His shoulders sagged, the weight of her accusation pulling him down. "At first, yes," he said softly. "That's what it was. A foolish, arrogant game. But Margareth, it stopped being that long before I even realized it. I didn't see it then, but you changed me. You made me see the kind of person I could be. The kind of love I was too proud to admit I needed." Margaretha's eyes flashed with anger and pain. "And yet you let me believe it was real, until the very end. You proposed in front of the entire village, married me under a Christmas tree, and still, you let me live a lie." "I was a coward," Santa said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to tell you the truth without losing you. And when you left, I realized that my lies cost me the only real thing I've ever had." The raw honesty in his voice gave Margareth pause, but she quickly steeled herself. "You say that now, but how do I know it's not just another performance? Another way to salvage your pride?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. He held it out to her, his hands trembling. "What's this?" she asked, taking it cautiously. "It's everything I've been doing since you left," Santa said. "I started visiting the places you used to care about, the orphanages, the shelters, the communities you always spoke of wanting to help. I've been working with the elves to create programs for the forgotten, the overlooked, the ones who feel like they don't belong." Margareth opened the notebook, her eyes scanning the pages. Each one was filled with meticulous notes, ideas, and plans for projects aimed at spreading kindness and inclusion. It was clear he had poured his heart into it. "I didn't do this to win you back," Santa continued. "I did it because you showed me that love isn't about grand gestures or charming words. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. It's about being better, even when no one is watching." Margareth closed the notebook, her hands trembling. She looked up at him, her emotions warring within her. "You hurt me, Nicholas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You made me believe in something that wasn't real. How can I trust you again?" Santa's eyes met hers, filled with sincerity. "I don't expect you to trust me, not yet, but I'm asking for a chance to earn it. Whether that takes a season or a lifetime, I'll wait. Because you're worth it, Margareth." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the village faded into the background as they stood in the quiet street, the snow falling softly around them. Finally, Margareth sighed, her breath clouding in the air. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly, "but I can see you've changed. And that's something." Santa nodded, his heart aching with both hope and remorse. "That's all I can ask for." Margareth looked down at the notebook in her hands, then back up at him. "It's Christmas Eve, Nicholas. Go spend it doing what you do best, bringing joy to others. And maybe we'll talk again someday." Santa swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you, Margareth, for even listening." As he turned to leave, Margareth watched him go, her heart heavy but not entirely closed. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of healing, not for his sake, but for her own. The northern lights shimmered in the sky above, a quiet promise that even in the coldest winters, there was room for warmth to return. The sleigh soared through the frozen sky, the jingling of bells and the rhythmic beat of reindeer hooves cutting through the silence of the night. The usual joy Santa felt on Christmas Eve, his favorite night of the year, was conspicuously absent. Instead, his thoughts were consumed by the confrontation with Margareth. As the northern lights shimmered above, his mind replayed her words, "You hurt me, Nicholas. How can I trust you again?" It wasn't the anger in her voice that haunted him. It was the pain. The realization that he had been the source of that pain weighed heavier than any sack of toys he had ever carried. He guided the sleigh down to a quiet rooftop in a small, snow-covered town. The world below was peaceful, the faint glow of Christmas lights visible through frosted windows. Santa climbed out of the sleigh, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached for the bag of toys, but his hands lingered on its edges as he stared out at the horizon. "What have I become?" he murmured to himself, his breath clouding in the frosty air. For centuries, he had seen himself as the embodiment of joy and generosity, a symbol of all that was good about the season. But Margaretha's words had shattered that illusion. He had used his position, his charm, and the trust of a kind-hearted woman to fee his pride, and now he was paying the price. He delivered the gifts on the rooftop, moving with less cheer than usual, and returned to the sleigh. As he continued his journey through the night, his mind wandered. When dawn broke, Santa returned to the North Pole. The elves greeted him with their usual excitement, their cheers echoing through the workshop as the reindeer were unhitched and led to their stables. But Santa barely acknowledged them, offering only a tired wave before retreating to his study. Inside, he sank into his chair, staring at the cluttered desk. Among the piles of parchment and schematics was Margaretha's note, the one she had left when she walked out of his life. He picked it up, the edges worn from how many times he had unfolded and read it. The words stung as much now as they had the first time. "I am not a game to be won, nor a challenge to be conquered." For the first time, Santa allowed himself to sit with the full weight of what he had done. He didn't try to justify it or dismiss it as a mistake. He faced it head-on, the shame settling deep in his chest. He needed to change, not to win Margareth back, though he longed for the chance, but because he couldn't continue being the man he had become. Over the following weeks, Santa began to shift his focus. He spent less time issuing commands and more time working alongside the elves, joining them on the factory floor to understand their concerns and ideas. He opened discussions about how the workshop could better serve the children of the world, not just with toys, but with real acts of kindness and inclusion. Santa also made time to visit the communities Margareth had written about in her notebook. He brought more than gifts. He brought conversation, compassion, and a genuine effort to understand their struggles. He listened to the stories of children who felt overlooked, families who had fallen on hard times, and communities that had been forgotten in the grand scheme of Christmas. The elves noticed the change. Peppermint, who had watched the bets spiral out of control with growing guilt, approached Santa one evening as he helped repair a broken toy conveyor. "You've been different lately," she said cautiously. Santa looked up from his work, his face thoughtful. "I've been trying to be better," he admitted. "Not for show, not for approval, just better." Peppermint hesitated, then nodded. "It suits you," she said softly. Jingles, the wise and often reserved elder elf, watched from a distance. He gave a quiet nod of approval, knowing that this was the change Santa had needed for a long time. The year passed quickly, the workshop buzzing with preparations for the next Christmas. But through it all, Santa's thoughts never strayed far from Margareth. He wondered how she was doing, if she had found peace in her new life. One evening, as the first snowfall of the season blanketed the North Pole, Santa sat by the fire with Margaretha's notebook in hand. He flipped through its pages, marveling at her vision, her dedication, and the care she poured into every detail. He didn't know if she would ever forgive him, but he hoped she could see the impact she had made, not just on him, but on the world. With a deep breath, Santa made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could ensure that her dreams didn't fade. He began drafting a plan, one that would honor her legacy and show her that her kindness had not been in vain. As the snow continued to fall outside, a sense of purpose filled him. This time, he wasn't acting out of guilt or a need for redemption. He was acting out of love, the kind of love Margareth had taught him to see. For the first time in months, Santa felt hope stirring in his heart. It wasn't a guarantee of reconciliation, but it was a step toward healing for both of them. The year had brought change not only to Santa Claus, but to the very spirit of the North Pole. His efforts to reimagine what Christmas could mean had revitalized the workshop and the elves, inspiring a deeper sense of purpose. Yet, despite the progress, one thing remained unresolved: Margareth. Santa knew that words alone would never rebuild the bridge he had burned. He needed to show her, through actions and time, that he had truly changed, not to win her back, but because she deserved to see that her kindness and belief in him had made a lasting difference. Winter Hollow was bustling as the holiday season approached. Margaretha's bakery had become the heart of the village, its warm lights and irresistible scents drawing people in from the cold. She had built a community around her work, one that thrived on generosity and connection. On a frosty evening, just as Margareth was closing up for the night, she noticed an envelope tucked into the frame of the bakery's door. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting. "Dear Margareth, this Christmas, I wanted to give you something meaningful. Not an apology, but a thank you. Because of you, I've seen the world differently. Because of you, I've learned what it means to truly care for others. I wanted to share what your kindness has inspired, and I hope you'll come and see it for yourself." Nicholas attached was a small, folded map with a marked route leading back to the North Pole. Margareth stared at it for a long time, her emotions swirling. She wasn't sure if she could face him again, but curiosity and the faintest spark of hope urged her forward. The journey to the North Pole felt different this time. As Margareth approached the familiar village, she was struck by subtle but meaningful changes. The workshop was adorned not just with its usual garlands and lights, but with banners promoting programs for underprivileged communities. Elves bustled about, carrying not just toys, but baskets of warm clothing, food, and letters addressed to children and families in need. Santa greeted her at the workshop entrance, his demeanor calm and humble. He wasn't wearing his grand red coat or wielding his usual air of authority. Instead, he looked like a man eager to share something important. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. Margareth nodded, her guard still up, but her curiosity piqued. "I wanted to see what this was about." Santa gestured toward the workshop, leading her inside. What Margareth saw took her breath away. The bustling factory floor was now a hub of innovation and generosity. Alongside the toys, there were stations for creating care packages, assembling educational kits, and crafting heartfelt letters. "This is what we've been working on all year," Santa explained as they walked. "Not just toys, but real support for the people who need it most. It's not perfect, but it's a start." He led her to a wall filled with photographs and notes from families around the world. Some were pictures of children holding toys, while others showed communities receiving much-needed supplies. Each note was a testament to the joy and hope these efforts had brought. "This was your dream," Santa said, turning to Margareth. "I just helped bring it to life." Margareth felt tears welling in her eyes as she scanned the wall. It was a reflection of everything she had hoped to do, everything she had once shared with him during quiet moments when she believed in their future together. "You did all this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We did," Santa corrected. "You inspired it. I only carried it forward." For the first time in a long while, Margareth saw sincerity in his eyes, a sincerity that couldn't be faked or rehearsed. She looked around the workshop, taking in the changes, and felt a flicker of warmth begin to melt the ice around her heart. As the tour ended, Santa escorted her to a small sitting room where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, breaking the silence. but I hope you can see that your kindness wasn't wasted. It changed me, Margareth. And it's still changing me. Margareth studied him for a long moment, her emotions a mixture of hesitation, gratitude, and something she couldn't yet name. This is beautiful, Nicholas, she admitted. But trust takes time to rebuild. I understand, he said softly, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. Margareth nodded, her gaze lingering on the fire. The journey to healing was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like it was possible. That night, as she prepared to leave the North Pole, Santa handed her a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. For your bakery, he said with a faint smile. When she opened it back in Winter Hollow, she found a collection of hand-carved cookie molds, each one depicting a scene from the new projects she had inspired. Children smiling, families gathering, and acts of kindness. As Margareth traced her fingers over the intricate designs, she felt a quiet hope stirring within her. Perhaps, in time, the scars of the past could give way to something new, a foundation built on respect, understanding, and genuine care. For now, she would focus on the present, confident that both she and Santa had begun the hard but meaningful work of redemption and growth. The following year passed with a quiet rhythm for Margareth. Her bakery in Winter Hollow continued to thrive, its reputation spreading to nearby villages. Customers flocked to taste her creations, drawn not just by the exquisite flavors, but by the warmth Margareth brought to every interaction. Yet despite the success and joy she cultivated in her work, there was a part of her heart that remained unresolved. The North Pole and Santa Claus lingered in her thoughts like the faint memory of a bittersweet song. As Christmas approached once more, Margareth found herself reflecting on her journey. She had rebuilt her life from the ashes of betrayal, proving to herself and others that her strength and compassion were unshakable. But forgiveness, true forgiveness, was a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. It was Christmas Eve when a letter arrived at her bakery, delivered by an elf she didn't recognize. The envelope bore no markings other than a single red seal stamped with the image of a snowflake. Curiosity compelled her to open it. Inside was a simple note, written in Santa's unmistakable hand. Margareth, this year, I've learned that forgiveness isn't something I can ask for, it's something I must earn. I've spent every day trying to live up to the kindness you showed me, even when I didn't deserve it. But Christmas is a time for hope, and so I'm inviting you to the North Pole one last time. Not to talk, not to reconcile, but simply to see what you've inspired. The door is always open if you choose to walk through it. Nicholas. Margareth stared at the note, her emotions warring within her. The invitation was unexpected, as was its tone of humility. For a long moment, she considered ignoring it. She had her own life now, her own happiness. She didn't need closure, but a part of her whispered otherwise. The journey to the North Pole was as breathtaking as she remembered. The snow-blanketed landscape sparkled under the light of the aurora borealis, and the village buzzed with the familiar energy of Christmas preparations. When she arrived at the workshop, she was greeted by elves she hadn't seen in over a year. Peppermint was among them, her fiery hair tucked under a striped cap. "Margareth," she exclaimed, her face lighting up. "You're here." Margareth managed a small smile. "I wasn't sure I would be." "He's been hoping," Peppermint said softly, glancing toward the workshop. Inside, the space had transformed into a testament to the new direction Santa had taken. Alongside the toy-making stations were areas dedicated to the community programs Margareth had first envisioned. Packages of warm clothing and blankets were prepared for delivery. Letters of encouragement were written to struggling families, and elves worked diligently to ensure no one was forgotten. In the center of it all stood Santa, directing the efforts with a calm, purposeful energy. When he saw her, he froze, his face a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "Margareth," he said, his voice low but warm. She nodded, taking in the scene around her. "This is incredible," she admitted, her gaze sweeping over the workshop. "It's all because of you," Santa said, stepping closer. your vision, your kindness. It changed everything. For a moment, they stood in silence, the noise of the workshop fading into the background. Margareth searched his face, looking for any trace of the arrogance or insincerity she once knew. But what she saw instead was humility and a quiet strength. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Santa said, his voice steady. "I just wanted you to see what you've inspired, and to say thank you." Margaretha's heart softened, the weight of the past slowly lifting. "I can see you've changed," she said, "and I'm glad for that." Santa nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll keep working to be better, no matter what. Whether or not you're part of my life, you'll always be a part of what I do." Tears welled in Margaretha's eyes as she felt the sincerity in his words. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I don't know what the future holds, Nicholas, but I think there's room for forgiveness. Maybe even something more, someday." A smile broke across Santa's face, soft and genuine. "That's more than I could have hoped for." As they stood together in the glow of the workshop, surrounded by the hum of activity and the warmth of the season, Margareth felt the last pieces of her heart begin to mend. She didn't know where their story would go from here, but for the first time, she felt ready to find out. Outside, the northern lights danced across the sky, a reminder that even in the coldest winters, new beginnings were possible. And as the bells of the sleigh jingled in the distance, Margareth allowed herself to believe in the magic of Christmas once again.